August 1967. Outlaws Bonnie and Clyde loom large on the big screen. You try to listen in, but there's something else coming down the line. In Hunter S. Thompson's first book, the Hells Angels motorcycle gang is roaring across California. You try to get a clear picture of these outlaws, but you can't tell if the vehicle has 2 wheels, 4, or 8. You must be experiencing double vision. I'm here this week with Sonya Mann, who is involved in indie publishing with a sort of sizable Twitter presence around the fringes of the tech industry, interested in how and why people organize themselves in the way that they do, coupled with this sort of aesthetic of whimsy and wonder, rabbits and so on. She runs a website, Sonya Supposedly, and through there she sends out a monthly zine. Today we're talking about Bonnie and Clyde, the film from August 1967, coupled with Hunter S. Thompson's first book, Hells Angels, the strange and terrifying saga of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. And so Sonya recently read the book, and so I'm going to let her sort of introduce that, what sort of drew her to that.
Well, Tim suggested, or, gave me the concept of this sort of comparing and contrasting two works from a specific year and looking about what they show about the time and the evolution of our culture. So I was looking through things that I'd read recently and trying to just Google movies that I liked and see if I could find a pair. And I did. I was actually really thrilled because I think that Bonnie and Clyde and Hells Angels actually do treat with some of the same themes. There's this whole outlaw culture, breaking away from the mainstream, defining yourself in opposition to the mainstream, which has an interesting inherent tension where you're trying to or embracing a different set of mores in terms of what's acceptable and what's glorified, but you're always have that touch point of like what is the mainstream acceptable, and sort of as an outlaw there is no your identity is being the breakaway, which is independent but not at the same time.
Right, and these are notably both, in contrast to most things I'll be doing, have a non-fictional element. So the film is drawn from two actual people, Bonnie and Clyde, though of course very reworked into sort of thrilling film, sort of glamorizing it into this romanticized portrait. And the book is this sort of dawning of what gets called gonzo journalism or something along those lines, where Thompson is very much a constant presence in this. He's talking about the Hells Angels, but it's all told through his own sort of encounter with them, which is this really sort of interesting dynamic where throughout the book you see that they are this very sort of outwardly hostile, where they have this own internal sense of brotherhood and they're out for each other, but everyone else is the sort of enemy, and somehow Hunter
is kind of aggressive machismo to the Hells Angels.
Yeah, and somehow Hunter S. Thompson, despite their especial hate for reporters, sort of embeds himself within them for around a year as a sort of freelance writer, and is able to put together this sort of book. And it's this, as Sonya was saying, this world of outlaws in both works, and setting up in this weird hyper reality that's sort of half sort of media image, and then also they themselves responding to the media image and trying to sort of create these sort of mediated versions of themselves.
Yeah, you see it in Bonnie and Clyde. You see them sort of performing for the newsletters, taking these photos of themselves. And actually, it's interesting that there are multiple layers to this, because you have the within the works, you have the representation of the relationship to the media, but then both are also both Bonnie and Clyde, the movie, and Hells Angels, the book, are fairly self-conscious artifacts in terms of how they were crafted, and both are highly aestheticized, but in different ways. You have this stylization in Bonnie and Clyde, where the costuming is impeccable, but it's also has this kind of artfully undone aspect to it, which is, it's all very intentional, very crafted. And then you have Hell's Angels, which is, as Tim said, it has this is this early gonzo, but it's also a very self-conscious presentation, because it's all, in this first person narrative of Hunter's own experiences with the Hells Angels. He goes into depth about he has a lot of derision for the mainstream press and how they covered the Angels, and how there's this kind of it's like a consensual illusion that both sides create to kind of promulgate to the general public. The Outlaws have an interest in a particular image of themselves. The media also has an interest in a particular image. Law enforcement is another player in this crafting the artifice that is then going to be sort of reified in its own right, which is they both works. I was saying to Tim earlier, there's this theme of presentation and performance is really big in both of them.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. So Hunter S. Thompson really sort of resents the rest of the sort of press and is constantly sort of jabbing at this is this big event that they're hyping up, but they're getting all of their news through the telephone where the police are explaining what's happening, and they're not just sending a reporter here and then there's a big event and he goes through 8 different newspapers, all get just basic facts radically different. And so he's giving the sort of on the ground perspective, and so it's his own little biased take, but it is definitely trying to present something of a fair light, but then he's also calling the Hells Angels losers. It's this sort of ultimate take. But this performative aspect is interesting because in some ways, they do this sort of intentionally, where in big events, he describes they'll dye their giant beards in bright colors and have all these sort of piercings, and they'll wear capes and go in a big motorcycle caravan and, just sort of cause chaos and try to be this very noticeable mass of human energy. And
there's something kind of camp about the Hells Angels, gritty camp. There's they have an element of the ridiculous in them. I guess any kind of motorcycle gang aesthetics it's in some way sort of ridiculous to be, riding around on this oily machine that makes a lot of noise, wearing leathers. You're not a fucking Hun. You live in the 60s in America. You're a rebel without a cause, but they kind of lean into that.
Yeah, there was one element to it that Thompson didn't press on too much, but he kept bringing up how their lifestyle is founded on this dynamic of working through the winter so that they can be eligible for unemployment through the summer, where they just go on sort of rampages through California. And yeah, they're taking on this very boisterous image, and they're very sort of self-conscious about how they're depicted in news and movies and stuff. And so I think what they imagine in keeping Thompson around for so long and keeping him so close and inviting him to all these sort of internal secretive meetings and such is that they I guess probably hope that he would put together a story that gives them something really to impress the nation with in some sense, where I don't think they even would necessarily mind being called losers, but they want to be seen as these sorts of tough outsiders doing their own thing. But it's this really complex line that as Sonya, you were bringing up, it's developed in this interesting tension with the police, where they're constantly getting into these sort of conflicts, but they're
always having to pay bail or bail people out or spend a night in the drunk tank or whatever.
Yeah.
There's a lot of in and out of the system interactions.
Yeah. And there's this one big point in the sort of center of the book, this big event that basically they get sort of cordoned off way away from everyone else, and there's basically no major arrests or anything that happens, and it actually ends up being this huge bummer for them, where they want to be the ones who are making national headlines as starting riots and causing havoc and getting arrested and so on. And so obviously having to pay bail all the time is this huge cost and such, but that's sort of, as Thompson presents it, the sort of goal where they want to be, the sort of public enemy. And that's the same thing with Bonnie and Clyde, is obviously that they want to get a lot of money, but there's this interesting dynamic where Clyde is presented as having sort of, he needs to really present himself as this successful criminal, to Bonnie. And Bonnie, you know, also tries to look tough for him as well. There's a lot of sort of humorous moments, like at the beginning, one of their first jobs is they go to this bank and he's trying to rob it, and the teller is like, oh, well, we failed 3 weeks ago, and he's sort of just sorting paperwork, and he takes the teller by gunpoint out to the car, and he's like, you got to explain to my woman what happened here so I don't come out empty-handed. And it's just this sort of absurd thing. And then the next thing is he's robbing this grocery store for groceries. He's not even getting money out of it. He's just trying to get like basic food so they could survive. And so there's this larger than life image propped up by the media that is sort of at odds with some of the reality, though Thompson says that in some ways the reality is worse than what the media said.
But in other, it's worse, but it's more sordid. It's more grimy, like less dramatic. Dramatic in a sort of theater sense. Like it's less, you know, the perfectly crafted beat. I was thinking about when you were talking about Clyde kind of like not necessarily living up to the image that he wants to. I was thinking about libidinal energy and how I almost want to say that the angels are like more successful as a channel for their own libidinal energy than Bonnie and Clyde are for theirs. Like Bonnie and Clyde have this, they accumulate some hangers-on who annoy them and, you know, Clyde's relatives. But they, as you mentioned, they have this kind of like escalating feedback loop in their own relationship where they kind of, there's tension between them, like erotic tension, but also just kind of both wanting. There's a lot of like frustrated desire, I think, in Bonnie and Clyde. Maybe also in Hell's Angels, but I feel like the Hell's Angels get their, trying to think of a non-vulgar way to say this. I guess they kind of get their climax to a greater degree. Or maybe the climax of Bonnie and Clyde is the very end when they all, you know, they get massacred. Or massacre sounds kind of judgment-y, when they get shot.
Right. And part of the feedback is Bonnie and Clyde get deeper and deeper into it, where eventually they have nowhere to go back to. There's a sort of emotional scene where Bonnie is missing her family, and so they go back to meet the mother, and you know, there's all these sort of people around in the extended family, and they're like, what if we get a house like nearby? And the mother's like, no, I don't want you anywhere near here. And also you can't do that because you have to keep moving forever or you'll die. Which is basically, so that's what does end up happening. And there's a similar thing with the Hells Angels where they need to prove themselves through criminality. And there's one point where Thompson talks about one chapter is maybe a little more lenient, and there's a sort of big guy in there who, if he tried to go to Oakland and join that chapter, they basically wouldn't let him do it unless he went out and committed a very major felony. And so basically there's this dynamic where it's like you have to put yourself in a position where being Hell's Angel is sort of your only option, even for people on the sort of periphery where they have, you know, these women who kind of circulate around within the Hells Angels or similar outlaw motorcycle gangs. And he talks about how some of them will get tattoos and how it's this major commitment because obviously if you do that and then you try to leave and sort of get married and so on, it's going to be this wild shock all of a sudden on the wedding night when you just have this property of Hells Angels or whatever.
Yeah. There's a great line in Hells Angels, which is, a man who has blown all his options can't afford the luxury of changing his ways. And that also very much, that sentiment applies to Bonnie and Clyde as well, and the people who they kind of suck into their orbit. Although it's interestingly both true and not true. Like, a man who has blown all his options can't afford the luxury of changing his ways. Well, a man who's blown all his options is also, you know, that's kind of the point when you are forced to change your ways, is when you have locked yourself, or have like backed yourself into a corner. And that's kind of the apotheosis, is like, do you transform and, you know, change into something else, or do you accept destruction rather than transformation is also a kind of destruction, right? Like, if you change your persona or whatever your current performance, your current role, if you change that, that's a kind of death of that role. So some people, and this is the finish of Bonnie and Clyde, is like they accept this rather than changing out of their rather than like going to turn themselves into the police or something, they go out in this blaze of glory kind of shootout. And I guess Hell's Angels has various trajectories for the angels. Some of them just kind of peter out or like age out, and some of them don't. Some of them die even. Like you mentioned that's one of the opening is this kind of the postmortem of one of those blazing out experiences.
Yeah, there's a quote that appears in the Thompson book from Paradise Lost that it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. And Bonnie and Clyde presents a sort of similar thing where eventually Bonnie writes this sort of song about Clyde and talks about how, they kept taking him down, locking him up in a cell till he said to me, "I'll never be free. So I'll meet a few of them in hell." And so the starting point is he's gotten out of jail, and the film is actually it's period piece set during the Great Depression. There's a lot of sort of poverty seen throughout the film, which is part of the premise of like the failed bank they go to first. And then the Hell's Angels is set during the 1960s, but you see some of the legacy of this sort of intergenerational sort of economic thing where, they come from families that don't really have much. And so rather than trying to sort of transform and sort of seek out higher, they just sort of dig in and commit themselves fully to this life in a way where they can't back out. They can only sort of indulge deeper and deeper in this world. But there's this fantasy that Clyde presents to Bonnie at the beginning of the film where he says, "You deserve so much more," and paints this image of her wearing silk in this nice hotel and how even that's not enough, and they're going to rob all these banks and get rich and sort of live this life of luxury. And yet as they go along, and they don't even really succeed very much at all, but as they go along, it's clearly that's never going to be an option, and that all they can sort of really do is sort of make their way from one hideout to another.
They do succeed in kind of instigating and cultivating their legend, which is like, it's a big part of what the movie is about, but then it's also why the movie exists at all, right? Is because they did, the historical figures who it's based on actually did inculcate a legend that kind of culturally persisted. And then you get it sort of rolled forward by this movie, which it's a very fashionable movie, it's all very beautiful. And that too is kind of a contrast between how well they embody this image just superficially versus how well it actually plays out in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, they're very sort of self-conscious about that. And the song I mentioned from Bonnie is something which is like, oh, I should send this to one of the papers and such. And it's not even this like intimate moment. It's always framed throughout this idea of, oh, they're going to be talking about us. And so there's the economics of it, but there's also this fascination with the outlaw image where it's not just about getting money through robbing banks, but it provides this weird sort of status that in both cases they find aspirational. And at the end of Hell's Angels, Thompson talks about how, they're losers, but they themselves will recognize that there's, millions of losers throughout America, and any one of them will pay all of their money to live just one day as the kind of losers that Hell's Angels are, with the level of sort of brutality and force and so on, which is, I think, partly their own projection that they choose this and they think highly of it. But there's this sense of, the outlaw as its own sort of success.
Yeah, it's outside of the system, in opposition to the system, and yet still longing for the recognition of the system, which is kind of, I guess it's part of the beautiful tragedy of it. And I wonder if you could argue that Thompson himself kind of embodies this archetype also with the gonzo journalism thing. I am personally not sure how much of a reliable narrator he is. He mentions pulling out his tape recorder a bunch of times, but I don't know. It's hard to tell how much of it is based on like notes and meticulous documentation and how much of it is just his own kind of embellished recollection of his hijinks with the Hells Angels. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so I mean, something I thought of was he talks about how, the Hells Angels are feeding into this demand within the media for sort of sensational stories about them, and that they sort of want to do something crazy that gives people something to talk about. And so it seems like Thompson is himself feeding into that desire for sensationalism. And so obviously he's not going to tell the story about this sort of boring day-to-day, but he's going to tell about, you know, the riots and the exciting things and the sort of tension building up and sort of comic mischief and non-comic mischief, very quite tragic, felonious, immoral encounters. And so, yes, the style of it is, it's like littered with quotes, and they're like sort of interweaved into the narrative where, you know, sometimes it's not really clear that it's someone else saying something until you get a few sentences down and it's like said such and such person. And so he's interweaving quotes from Hell's Angels and police and media and in some cases sort of, you know, films and poetry and so on. But he's...
And he has his own ethos also. Like in particular, when he talks about the like rape, the alleged anyway rape incidents and like the degree to which they did or didn't happen, in his opinion, he offers up this is a quote that I saved. Women are terrified of being raped, but somewhere in the back of every womb there is one rebellious nerve end that tingles with curiosity whenever the word is mentioned. This is even more terrifying, for it hints at basic depravity and secret lust too dangerous to even think about. Which I think it's funny how well this exact sentiment is echoed in kind of modern, like, manosphere, the red pill kind of worldviews. But I think that kind of gives a taste of the degree to which Thompson himself is kind of, he has a little bit of an outlaw persona and a little bit of like that sort of machismo, that like chauvinism that the Hells Angels themselves embody. Like he definitely identifies with them to a degree. And he talks about that to some extent also.
Right, yeah. So within the Hells Angels, there is this element of intentionally provocative edginess that has some resonances today. And, you know, they'll have, you know, swastikas and iron crosses and so on, and will, you know, say that it's basically this way of distinguishing themselves from normal, polite society, what you might now call normies. And so Thompson himself stylistically is caught up in trying to write, you know, about this in what is a candid way, but also through that is somewhat of an edgy way where, you know, he's not trying to clean it up or moralize, which is the sort of work of, you know, the Times and the New York Times and the Post and whatever else, but he's trying to, you know, just sort of give this like really real on the ground look at everything that happens, the build up, the reasoning, the people involved. And so, yeah, so I think he really revels in giving those sorts of counter moralistic accounts of how this all sort of plays out.
Yeah, I would say Thompson's aesthetic is like rawness. And what's interesting to me anyway is that it is still an aesthetic. It's still its own performance. You know, it's not really an unfiltered view because it's not something you can do with a book. It's just not possible to actually replicate like firsthand experience. And I'm not saying this to like detract from Thompson. I thought it was a good book. I really enjoyed it. But it's something that's kind of, I think he knows it too. Like he knows that he's putting on an act. At least I think he does. I don't know. It's hard to say for sure. Something that you mentioned when we were talking about what we were going to talk about that I thought was interesting was when the Hells Angels get to do a bunch of LSD with these kind of like 60s counterculture luminaries, which is a weird like clash of worlds where you have the kind of effete like writerly types who are, you know, have this kind of, it's in LA, right? Like they have a mansion in LA. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, they end up, you know, sort of culmination of the book is they end up doing parties in Ken Kesey's house and like in this sort of beat world and running into the sort of anti-war protests and such.
Which kind of clashes with the politics of the Angels, such as they are. Like at one point, Thompson writes, "The Angels, like all other motorcycle outlaws, are rigidly anti-communist. Their political views are limited to the same kind of retrograde patriotism that motivates the John Birch Society, the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party. They are blind to the irony of their role, knight-errants of a faith from which they have already been excommunicated. The angels will be among the first to be locked up or croaked if the politicians they think they agree with ever come to power. And this is another commentary on artifice, right? Like the angels' politics, at least as Thompson tells it, are almost like they're like patches on their vests or something. You know, they're politics as like shield or as like armor, but a kind of display armor, not so much what you would actually use to joust with, I guess. And which I don't know, it's interesting. And it's interesting how that kind of, you know, once there's the prospect of getting free drugs, any kind of political clash is just sort of irrelevant.
Yeah, there's this fundamental tension between them and this emergence of a new counterculture. And, you know, they're sort of at odds with this idea of, you know, sort of passive resistance, anti-war stuff, which is sort of against their sense of raw energy and violence. And, you know, the sort of what Thompson suggests that ultimately, you know, they try to say that the swastikas and stuff are like just for sort of show and to keep people sort of at a distance, but that they do ultimately have some level of fascistic sort of impulse, and they risk losing a sort of cultural prominence. You also see through the sort of, you know, prominent cultural position of Bonnie and Clyde with the emergence of this new counterculture and the beats and so on. And so there's, you know, throughout the book, you get these sort of clashes with other motorcycle gangs where they have mildly different sort of standards and policies, and they're just sort of, there just happen to be a different group from a different place. And this is like a whole radically different sort of challenge to them, where it's like this idea of the outlaw that they're sort of upholding and that's being romanticized around the same time with Bonnie and Clyde is maybe sort of on the way out culturally. And that's the sort of biggest threat of all to them. Something
that through whatever jump of the brain, that makes me think about how this is, so at least as Thompson depicts the angels, there's an element of organized crime to them, but they're very much not like a well-oiled criminal outfit. This is not, you know, sort of like drug running is still not hyper developed, and kind of the competitive pressures that later turn Hell's Angels and some of the other motorcycle gangs into like legitimate's not the right word, into like successful illegal gangs that are, you know, doing weapons dealing, that kind of thing. That comes later, at least it seems so. If at this stage of the development of the group, they're still kind of like chaotic, and they're not necessarily great at pulling off like heists. And you see the same thing with Bonnie and Clyde, where like they have the bravado, they have the willingness to transgress, but they're not like that great at actually setting up their stings, or, you know, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of they're great at embodying they're great at the performance aspect of it, like the aesthetic of it. But they're not actually, as you mentioned earlier, all that criminally successful.
Yeah, there's a very brief mention in the book about some Hell's Angels smuggling drugs in from Mexico, but it doesn't really seem like wide structural thing. The group is very, you know, just sort of distributed and so on. Although also what Thompson emphasizes at several points is that the media likes to pretend that they're much bigger and more widespread than they are, because it makes the stories more exciting, and that actually there's very few of them. But
just to cut in for a second, which is kind of directly mirrored with how our current media deals with groups like the Proud Boys, which is, you know, it's way less of a thing than it's made out to be.
Right.
But anyway, go on.
Right. That they want to pretend there's like, you know, 30 million of them, but it's actually more like
100 in each major metropolitan area or something. It's like very insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. But so in Bonnie and Clyde, there's this weird ensemble that gets increasingly sort of silly and not this serious criminal sort of mastermind idea where, you know, so it starts out with the two of them, and then they bring in C.W. Moss, who was the sort of mechanic that, like, you know, they just happen to be like, hey, you know, you want to join us? And he's like, oh, okay. And then they bring in his brother and, you know, sort of incidentally, begrudgingly, his wife as well comes along. And then there's at one point they kidnap Gene Wilder and Gene Wilder's wife, and they're
That's so good.
And they're even sort of less on board, but they're with them at this moment where they sort of get this encounter with this Texas Ranger character who, you know, they end up sort of tying up and humiliating, and you know, they take like pictures with him as if he's like one of their friends, and like Bonnie kisses him in one of the pictures to like show that they're super close, and they sort of kick him off in a boat while he's still tied up. I had this like inherent sense of anxiety, like, oh man, they just like killed that man, but they did not. But but there's a real sort of
they leave him to tell the tale.
Right. There's a real sort of comic element to the sort of flow of the story where their jobs are in some ways getting more serious, where they start eventually actually getting in some money, but they're building up this gang of sorts that's very different from how that sort of Hell's Angels like to depict themselves. It's like this complete opposite. It's just these very normal people who want nothing to do with this, but just sort of happen to sort of accumulate in this ball around Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, there's a farcical quality to it. And it's like they use their sort of sheer charisma and then their willingness to transgress to like build up the entourage that they have. And to, you know, do these kind of for their own amusement, they're going to pull someone in and then push them back out again. And that's where their exercise of power like works the best, is in arranging these kind of, it's almost like a tableau that they put together for themselves.
Oh yeah.
But then it also backfires eventually.
Well, actually, it's something interesting is in the film, it shows how they're actually fairly sympathetic at many points. You know, there's one scene early on where they're holed up in this foreclosed house, and the former owner comes by, and they sort of make friends where like they give him their gun and let him like blast out the windows and shoot the sign with the bank's name on it. And there's a point where they rob a bank and they take the bank's money, but they ask someone, is that your money? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, all right, then keep that. And the police are interviewing him, and he's saying, you know, I'll go to their funeral. They were great. And so the setting here is the Great Depression, and so you have all these sort of poor people who are sort of let down by the banks, and so they have the resentment where they don't really care that Bonnie and Clyde are going around robbing these banks. And there's an interesting thing that happens at the end of Hell's Angels I forgot about, where it's not just these sort of peaceful anti-war protesters in this new counterculture, but that the police find that they've been hyping up the Hell's Angels so much as being rowdy, but actually they're finding like the youth at this time even like worse, where you have people blocking firefighters and like stomping on a baby, and all this crazy stuff starts coming up at the end. And there's this sense that basically the Hell's Angels are sort of just this, you brought up this quote that they're the first wave of a future that nothing in our history has prepared us to cope with.
Yes. I liked a destructive cult, which the mass media insists on portraying as a sort of isolated oddity, a temporary phenomenon that will shortly become extinct now that it's been called to the attention of the police. But as you were saying, I really liked what you brought up, that the Hell's Angels are proto-cyborgs, and that they're this like very raw and kind of just like crudely grafted together man-machine that then becomes almost like the kind of a dominant archetype. I keep thinking of futurism, actually, like futurism, the art movement that's tied to like Italian fascism, that like gotta go fast energy.
Oh, right. Yeah, I hadn't considered that, but I think there's something of that where it's like, obviously none of the Hell's Angels would, you know, really get that. And there's something in the book, I forget what it is, but Thompson tries to explain their problem with the Beats and their anti sort of communist attitudes, that there's like a level at which what they're critiquing is actually, you know, like the middle class and these terms that they themselves would never think to use. But yeah, so they're these sort of man-machine hybrids where like, you know, the motorcycles are a key part of them, and yeah, this idea of speed and so on. But then they're also, as Thompson mentions, they're left out of this emerging highly technical economy that they have their limited fascination with these machines, but as the society at large grows sort of more deeply technical, they don't really want to make that jump. That's a big sort of sticking point.
This makes me think of how like Bonnie and Clyde have this kind of, this like affectation of a sort of Robin Hood, as you were saying, they're in opposition to the banks. But that is kind of just another act. Like they don't really, that's not really what's motivating them, nor is it like a particularly big part of their overall program, if you want to call it a program. And it's like in both, I keep circling back to both of them, like the outlaw position, the outlaw archetype it can only exist in juxtaposition to all that it opposes. Like you can't be an outlaw without a society that we otherwise live in to rebel against. Like you can't, I don't know. Does that make sense? What do you think?
Yeah, they need to have some sort of enemy that is sort of justified, and they run into problems at the end of the book where they start coming into conflict with these sorts of political energies that there's only like 3 or 4 people in the group that really understand what any of them are talking about, but they basically sort of all just go along with it. But early on, it's just this simplistic sense of, there's this surrounding context that's very distinct from Bonnie and Clyde, the surrounding context of a relatively well-off California world where they move around sort of nice farms in the Bay Area, and their animosity is directed toward this sort of polite society, but
they feed off of it. Like they get drawn back to like engage with the system, with the mainstream, because it's their source of like resources. And Bonnie and Clyde are like that also. Like they get drawn back in over and over again because that's where like their energy is ultimately drawn off of the system, and without it, they don't have that source of, I guess I would go back to like libidinal energy.
Right. Yeah. So one of the big parts at the center of the book is this big celebration that gets sort of brought up onto this mountain. And there's this, basically thing that happens where once they don't have that society to like run into conflict with, it ends up just being this terrible experience where people are sort of just like taking pills to try to stay up just because, they have to create these sort of rituals where it's like, oh, if you don't stay up, someone's going to do some terrible thing to you, like within the Hells Angels policing themselves, that, there's no particular reason. It's just you have to do it. And most people are really in sort of despair, that they're used to engaging with sort of young women from the area, but they basically, the police say you have to leave by this point or, you're staying the night. And so like most people leave, and then it's sort of just them, and it's ends up being such a real downer.
Yeah, it doesn't live up to their expectations. They sometimes fail to live up to their own hype, which is, I think, it's almost disillusioning, right? Like you need to sort of mask it with drugs so that you don't realize how pathetic you are as an angel in that situation.
Yeah, and it's run in contrast to the sort of big event toward the beginning of the book, which is this sort of situation on the beach where they get their initial big national media reputation, where they like to present it as, oh, they just want to sort of be off by themselves on the sort of outskirts of this town. And it just sort of just so happens that, people show up to, interact with them and so on, and they can't help that. But yeah, so they thrive on that. And then especially once the media gets involved, they end up really loving how they're depicted as these sorts of outlaw figures that they want to be. And it ends up, sort of growing from there where they want to be those figures. And it ends on this sort of, there's this comical image in the last chapter or two where the leader of one of the big chapters of Hell's Angels is giving like a press conference, and there's like 12 cameras and like 40 microphones in front of him. And so that they want to present themselves as these sort of outlaws on the outskirts of society, at odds with polite society and the sort of major New York press and so on. But they also really want to be, seen by all of those groups.
There's something that runs through both works, or at least that comes up in both of them, is this like conflict as catharsis. You get like the buildup of tension and mutual animosity that is then kind of culminates and flares up and dissolves at some kind of like conflict that is it's like almost like a pitched battle. Not quite. It's a little more organic than that. It's like two partners dancing and building up to like a very dramatic dip at the end of the dance. And you see that it comes up with the angels and how they engage with the press, how they engage with law enforcement, how they engage with the mainstream, and likewise with Bonnie and Clyde. And it makes me think about sort of like Gerardian scapegoat notions that people have been talking about a lot lately. How we've been discussing how the outlaws need the mainstream and how they need to be able to have a relationship with the kind of the system of society, even as they oppose it. And I think that vice versa is also true, that like society, we live in a society, as you know, and it produces its malcontents, but it also is fascinated by them. It kind of feeds off of them in return. There's like an exchange of energy that takes place between the dissidents and the normative.
Right. And to go back to an earlier point, so this is also Thompson making his own career off of presenting this world to, a sort of mass audience published with the sort of major press, giving this sort of extensive look into this world. And then, so at the same time, you have Bonnie and Clyde as this major Hollywood film presenting the sort of outlaw dynamic as well. And so it's becoming, there's this really sort of mainstream, countercultural energy that's emerging at the time that is, really at odds with what you would sort of want it to be, which is, this truly sort of fringe, world.
Counterculture itself becomes a commodity that is, traded alongside all the others.
And then, so there's also something you brought up, which is the this sense of masculinity, where in the film, Clyde mentions, early on that he's not much of a lover boy, and there's these frequent sort of failed attempts to do stuff with Bonnie.
Yeah, he has moments of impotence.
Yeah.
In a literal sense.
Yeah. And so all he can do is through this sort of criminal behavior present this sort of masculine image. And then there's Thompson presents sort of interesting similar things with the Hells Angels, where this really sort of aggressive sexuality coupled with this sort of strong sense of brotherhood, which includes these dynamics of wildly kissing each other for show in front of people to sort of put them off.
There's a Thompson line that I saved, which is the vanity of the many swamped by the discretion of the few. And actually, I only saved this snippet, so I don't even know what like the larger sentence was that this phrase was in. But it's like the ability to disrupt is always the individual's prerogative. There's like an asymmetric warfare in it, like to shock, to destroy. There's that's always something that's open to the those who define themselves in opposition. You can always tear down. You can always create upheaval.
Right, and I think in the end, Thompson, I think, aligns maybe a little too closely with the Beats in opposition to the Hells Angels, and suggests that despite all this sense about brotherhood and camaraderie, when Allen Ginsberg says to the sort of leader of this Hells Angels chapter that he loves him, he's like thrown for this loop and has no idea what to do or say. But I do think this goes back to this idea where, he's the sort of central character in this narrative, and he's presenting, his own story as much as he is theirs. Mm-hmm. And so it builds up to this conflict with, the sort of Beats and sort of late 60s counterculture. But there is a sense about, Thompson partly identifies with some elements of this sort of Hell's Angels group, but ultimately I think he finds more in these sorts of other groups that are emerging. And that's, I think, is sort of part of how it sort of just sort of ends up unfolding.
I think Thompson has a little bit of, I think he has a little bit of a nose for fashion, or for, fashion's not the right word, for up and comingness, I guess. Like he does this kind of close examination of the Hells Angels, and he determines that they represent a type that is really has like is burgeoning. But that they themselves, like the particular instantiation of that type, he doesn't see a future in them. Certainly not for himself.
Right. And so, yeah, so there's...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I wanted to read another quote, which was, this is fairly early on. I think he's first meeting some of the angels. So this is Thompson saying, by this time, Sonny had introduced me to Lewis and some of the others. He's a writer, Barger said with a smile. God only knows what he's writing, but he's good people. Lewis nodded and shook hands with me. How you making it, he said. If Sonny says you're okay with him, you're okay with us. He said it with such a wide smile that he thought he was going to laugh. Then he clapped me on the shoulder in a quick, friendly sort of way, as if to make sure I understood that he'd pegged me for an arch con man, but that he wasn't going to ruin the joke by letting Sonny in on it. And I think Lewis is actually kind of correct here in his assessment, or his imputed assessment of Thompson, that Thompson is kind of assuming, which is that he is going to as he said, kind of use the angels to make his own reputation, that he's going to, it's almost like alchemical, that he's going to take their outlaw energy and use it to cement his own place in the establishment, or in the kind of the establishment side of the counterculture, or something like the monetizable version of it.
Right. Yeah. So he's spending the whole book parsing out all the really cool and exciting elements of Hell's Angels from all the sort of morally detestable parts, and saying that there's this core energy that's going to have this lasting cultural lineage that's not them themselves, but that, maybe he can be a part of, or, at least sort of follow along tightly. And
Thompson kind of perpetuates his hypothesis by writing about them. Like he helps to craft and cement the legend of the Hells Angels. Like, even as he decries how they're depicted by the mainstream press, he is perpetuating that same image. He's just presenting a sort of raw, like quote unquote raw flavor of the same product.
Right. Yeah. So he's
like, if you compare Thompson's depiction of this kind of outlaw culture to the Hollywood glamour of Bonnie and Clyde, there's a very different way of kind of presenting the same thing, which is you can be outside the mainstream. And this is what this sort of destructive but glorious cycle looks like.
Right, and there's this very overt violence in Bonnie and Clyde. I remembered reading online this suggestion that it was sort of this turning point in Hollywood towards showing more sort of bloody violence. And, I expected to go back and see a film from the 1960s from present perspective and find it kind of childish and simple in that regard. But there's the scene early on where they shoot the bank manager in the face, and there's the sort of end where they're sort of shredded, that, it is actually sort of quite, not exactly gory, but there's definitely a
visceral, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, they show the bodies, twitching and lurching as they're peppered by bullets.
Yeah, and so it gives this sense of this limited lifespan to this lifestyle. But there's the sort of meta element of it, that the appeal of the film, the mass appeal of the film, and it's had this major sort of cultural lineage, is that there's this desire for these outlaw narratives and these sorts of folklorish figures of Bonnie and Clyde and so on. And so there's this interesting way of taking these sorts of real stories and then extracting the sort of thrilling core of it and making it one's own.
I gotta wonder what Freud would make of these. Like, would he see it as a sort of like orgasm of death, like death drive kind of manifestation of that desire? I don't know enough about Freud to be sure. That's what the crafted media image of Freud would think.
There's this definite sense through the way Thompson presents the Hells Angels that their sort of sense of absolute violence and fearlessness is maybe something along those lines. When I was reading about the sort of real life Bonnie and Clyde, it was suggested that they always sort of imagined that they would inevitably, be killed off, that it was inevitable. And I thought in the film, they really depict them as not expecting that. And it sort of takes them by surprise that they keep sort of expecting that somehow they'll sort of break free and have this shift into some sort of greater freedom.
Yeah, and it doesn't end up working out. It's like they're only able to find this kind of provisional freedom where they're always on the run and are constrained by that. That in itself turns out to be it's like a prison in motion.
Yeah, but there is this temporary freedom within that, in some sense, where, you see this impoverished world where people are losing their homes and so on. And so they're living in pretty rundown places. They're kind of scraping by, but, at least they find some sense of home and family in this sort of weird way. And that's the same sort of thing with Hell's Angels, is they craft for themselves this vast extended family that, it has this sort of ride or die sensibility.
And it gives them a way to live high on the hog, pun intended, outside of their normal class strictures. Like in both cases, the Hells Angels the Hells Angels and Bonnie and Clyde, neither group is like particularly high class, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. And so the kind of like, they don't get to go to any like Gatsby style parties, and especially in the context of the Great Depression. Like, this is a way to be extravagant that they might not have access to otherwise.
Right. Yeah. They get to sort of fake being these sorts of well-off gangsters in a way where even if they don't quite make it, they get to sort of just like pretend it. There's a weird
they get to indulge in excess.
Yeah. There's the highly sort of, aesthetic sort of ending to the book Hell's Angels, where all of a sudden Thompson sort of is just talking about himself and how this scene where he goes off on this motorcycle ride at night and really sort of just going deep into the feeling of absolute freedom in the moment of just sort of speeding down this night road on this motorcycle, going faster and faster, just nearing this edge at which, there's a certain point at which you can't handle it and you'll sort of die. And this thrill of just sort of skirting that edge. And through that, he understands some of the drive of the Hells Angels. But I thought it was interesting where there's no other passage like that throughout the book, but in the very end, all of a sudden he brings it to himself and what he sort of like his personal epiphany from it all.
I feel like he kind of uses that moment to express, like, if it's not genuinely dangerous, it's not thrilling. Like, if there's nothing really at risk, if you're not actually endangering your life and limb, then you're not a badass, kind of. It's like, that is the price of that feeling.
Right. And that's, I guess, how Bonnie and Clyde starts out, where they're in town and he shows her he has the gun and she's like, oh, but you won't actually do anything with it. And so he has to go into the store and like steal like a few dollars or something, where it's like there's the image, but there also has to be some truth to it. So we were talking earlier about how they exist in the sort of tension between the sort of police and the media and stuff, and they want to hype up this image of them as outlaws. But there is always some core reality they have to upkeep. And so there's like the terrible, fact of constantly being arrested and having to pay bail and so on. But without that, they wouldn't actually be outlaws. They would just sort of, be losers, sort of causing a muck among themselves.
Yeah, like in a real sort of barbarian society, they'd be the bottom rung. But transgression as a source of power, and as a transgression as a means of altering social reality, that in a way that affords you status that wouldn't be available if you weren't willing to transgress and willing to sort of accept the penalties because the power that you get from it is, considered worth it, or at least feels worth the price in the moment. Because there's something sort of inarguable about a bank robber, right? Like no one's, if you come with a gun and say hand over all the money, maybe the bank has failed, but you're not going to get a kind of, you're not really going to get looked down on, say. You're not going to have someone thinking that you're not a big man, right? Because you're the one with all the authority when in that situation that you've created for yourself. And like that, Clyde's manhood and his struggles with his own manhood, like there's definitely a phallic gun element of Bonnie and Clyde, just like there's a phallic motorcycle element of the Hells Angels.
There's the scene based on sort of real life of Bonnie taking the photo with the cigar and the gun by the car, where a sort of like even she sort of gets caught up in the sort of image somewhat playfully, and Clyde is like taking the picture and he's like telling her to smile and stuff, and she's like really insistent on like putting on the sort of tough image, and so it's this sort of nice scene where it sort of just shows how put on it is in some way, but you're right, there is this absolute reality where it's like when you're in the bank with the gun taking actual money, it's all very real, and the power you have in that moment is very real.
Yeah, you've imbued yourself with the authority to give orders and be listened to.
And it's at this moment where, it's seemingly like the capacity for the individual to do that seems to be increasingly fading away. And so that's the sort of future that Thompson is seeing. And at least as he presents it, the Hells Angels themselves don't really sort of seem to have that sort of foresight. But as this writer figure, he gets to see the bigger picture. And so he sees that, the sort of freedom that the Hells Angels enjoy right now is going to sort of get increasingly clamped down on, but that energy is going to have to go somewhere, basically.
There's mass society, I think, is much more present as a theme in Hell's Angels. Like you see kind of the precursors of it happening in Bonnie and Clyde, which is, it's a period piece. It's a look back into, say, 30-ish years ago, maybe more like 40 years ago, because I think it was 1967 that these both came out. And you have the beginnings of this media hyper-reality that's running through the headlines. And then Hell's Angels is after the events of it, or after, several decades of TV, right? Although, you don't get quite the like cable TV 24-hour news cycle yet, as far as I recall. I might be getting the timing there a little wrong. But over the course of, the last century, which it was a little more than midway through when these works come out, just kind of grappling with the emergence of a national mass society and its feelings about itself, its like engagement with the archetypes that make it up.
So there's this development in both works of these sort of American folklorish figures that's in both cases somewhat self-consciously developed.
That's something that's really interesting to me, is that like these things emerge and evolve organically, but there's it's like organic in the sense that, say, like now the motorcycle outlaw, it's something that's created by lots of different works all kind of playing off each other. But each individual work is very self-conscious and is very, very much like, here's a commentary on this thing. But then together, it's like semi-controlled, I guess. I find that sort of tension between the artificiality and the organic growth of it interesting. Like the American Outlaw, these two works were not like coordinated in their contributions to, the archetype of the American outlaw. And yet they both have this very sort of studied presentation of the outlaw in its juxtaposition to normative society, and particularly in its relationship with the media and law enforcement. Like both works deal with that just because that is a thing. Like that's a response to what the reality of it is to have this be kind of the themes of the commentary. And they're both such different works, but they at the same time have this like thematic resonance with each other. And it's all very crafted and yet at the same time organic. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, definitely.
Culture, man. Should we look at, the 60s as kind of a precursor to our own era of counterculture? How do these works prefigure as Thompson suspects, kind of what's going on now.
I think Thompson, as someone who's sort of writing more overtly nonfictional, where like the film is very sort of deeply embedded in creating a film with like, sort of thrilling film beats and glamorizing this image. The book is very much, a reflection on things, and so gives a more overt sense of the sort of underlying ideas. But there's something interesting in the film, just in the fact that, it's Bonnie and Clyde, and so it's this sort of inclusive look at this energy, whereas the book rather is entirely focused in on the sort of group of, hyper masculine men acting out sort of among themselves. There's the wider dynamic just sort of inherently in the film in giving sort of, the two of them together. And
I would say that Bonnie goes through more of a transformation than Clyde does, I think. I mean, it's debatable. But she grows into this outlaw figure. She sort of like almost grows more like him. She takes on something of his aspects through their association.
Clyde is interesting, though, because he's sort of already been through it. He's already done something in the past and gone to prison. And there's a detail that doesn't really like play into like things plot-wise, but it's sort of just part of his character, where he had like cut off 2 toes with an axe in prison to try to get out of work detail. And there's a schemer bit to that, but it's also this sense of avoiding work in a way, the sense of that I think is interesting. He's not trying to prove himself in a way.
He has a little bit of a con man aspect to him. Like how he reels in Bonnie, for sure. Like it's actually even a little ambiguous how much he believes his own kind of romantic enchanting tale. I'm not sure that the movie really comes down in one way or the other in terms of how much does he buy into his own image, I guess.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic there where she seems to sort of complete his outlaw dynamic in this way that is sort of culturally distinct, but like he seems to me like immediately sold on this somehow, that Yeah,
I think you're right that adding her is like a piece that falls into place for him, and their kind of like mutual devotion is like it sustains things for them. And you almost even wonder, could they be together in a sort of white picket fence kind of way? I don't know. I'm not sure that either of them would actually be satisfied with that, as much as they like to fantasize about that option.
Yeah, they're always, sort of just bouncing along from like sort of beat to beat. And
that's why like Bonnie becoming enamored with him in the first place is like predicated on him being this outside the law chaotic element.
Right. And so, but she also is in this position where, I mean, her drive in this is interesting. And I think he maybe even sort of misunderstands it at many points, where his initial pitch is, that she's from the sort of fairly poor family and working as a sort of waitress, and he understands how it's unfulfilling, and she wants something more in life. But, he talks about her being draped in silk in a fancy hotel and all these riches and stuff. But really the excitement of it, I think, is part of it. Some of it is being completely smitten by him and sort of just following along anything he does. But there's a sense in which it seems like, maybe she wouldn't do it without him, but, she doesn't quite need the...
It's like, well, she sticks around even when that dream does not really come to fruition, or is only sort of fleetingly available, like the luxury part that he promises. She stays around even when that's not present, or when it's kind of not going well. I feel like Clyde like starts the movie as the man who has blown all his options and can't afford the luxury of changing his ways. But she goes into that position. She chooses it by engaging with him and sticking with him. She kind of converts into the person who blows all their options over the course of the movie. Like she, becomes involved. She becomes more directly involved with the crimes as the movie goes on, wielding the gun herself and everything.
Right. And so there's this absence of that sort of dynamic in the Hells Angels book, where we see the Hells Angels themselves, but we don't see, any sort of Bonnie-like figures. They have wives and stuff that are sometimes sort of involved in some ways, but they're completely sort of outside of the book's narrative, even when they're around, which is interesting. And
more accessories than characters.
Right, yeah. And then even at the end, when you get into the new sort of counterculture with the beats and the anti-war stuff, it's all Allen Ginsberg, Ken Casey, Neil Cassidy comes up briefly, and so you see it's very much sort of world of male outcasts. And, I think one thing that Bonnie and Clyde captures in its legacy is, increasingly there is, economic opportunities and so on for women, but it's also this like increasing room for them to fail socially and morally and so on in these ways. And there's something aspirational in a way with Bonnie, where it's like you can see yourself in her, where Thompson talks about the Hells Angels watching this earlier film from the 50s, The Wild One, and like they see themselves in that. And I think there's something where later generations acting out different sort of, not necessarily outlaw, but like outcasty sort of roles, that you now have this image of Bonnie to live up to.
Yeah, she's very much an aspirational. She's so beautiful. Like Faye Dunaway is just absolutely stunning in this role. And, the fashion is all very intentional and very like luxe and gorgeous, even when it's kind of like she's just the waitress or whatever. She's still this like absolutely exquisite creature kind of. And yet she has this dangerous edge to her at the same time. She's like a hawk or something. That's one of the things that I found that I love so much about this movie, is how like alluring and enchanting it is, while at the same time there's this kind of stark violence to it. It's the mood. It's like the mood of getting drawn into something that is absolutely a terrible idea, but is nonetheless, it's exciting and beautiful in its destruction.
Yeah, the film builds up very well this sense of wanting to be Bonnie and Clyde, and then just completely destroys that. Whereas the film, or sort of the book rather, is constantly, just like they're really not aspirational at all, unless you happen to already be very much within their sensibilities.
I think Hunter is the aspirational aspirational character in the book. He's the go-between and the person who gets to sort of exfiltrate some of the like status of the outlaw in a way that will actually be beneficial to him.
Yeah, he gets to enjoy some of the sort of wild partying and the thrill of the motorcycle riding in a way that's more exciting than they depict these sorts of mainstream motorcycle clubs that are completely lawful. He gets to go a little beyond that into some of the more thrilling aspects, but he doesn't descend into the sort of immoral elements of the Hells Angels as he depicts them.
At least not that he tells us about. I really wonder how reliable he is. And I always wonder that about any kind of like gonzo journalism, or the some of the more like writerly, literary, like new journalism style. And maybe that's kind of that sort of adds to the thrill of reading it as well, is that things could be left out, things could be embellished, and the nature of the product is that it's hard to tell. That ambiguity is itself kind of exciting.
Yeah, I mean, there's one point toward the end where there's a little footnote where it's name removed at instruction of publishers' lawyers. That is the sort of reminder that anything that he did to sort of build up trust with the Angels, there's no way the lawyers would be yeah, we'll publish your confession to that. But what you get now maybe is a little more freedom in that sort of reporting, where it's there's obviously laws still, but there's less friction in terms of what you can sort of just throw out online, which is, in some ways very dangerous because there are still laws. August 1967. Outlaws Bonnie and Clyde loom large on the big screen. You try to listen in, but there's something else coming down the line. In Hunter S. Thompson's first book, the Hells Angels motorcycle gang is roaring across California. You try to get a clear picture of these outlaws, but you can't tell if the vehicle has 2 wheels, 4, or 8. You must be experiencing double vision. But that's something where the legacy of this sort of writing is this completely frictionless online, just sort of here's the story of me in these wild sorts of situations.
Yeah. You might wreck yourself, but you're not required to be respectable. We have people like Hunter to thank for blazing that trail.
And we have the film, I guess, to thank for, giving a aspirational twinge to it all.
Yeah, another movie, which is kind of the successor to Bonnie and Clyde, is Natural Born Killers. It's like an updated version, which I just highly recommend for anyone who's listening and is interested in this kind of outlaw image and like outlaw as mass media creation theme.
I'll definitely check that out myself. And I guess we can wrap up on this sort of outward suggestion.
Well, thank you for inviting me on the podcast. It was an interesting discussion, and it was interesting to give more serious thought to these two works.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. This is a great discussion, and also, thank you for bringing up this suggestion of this topic.